Chuck came to talk about his charity, but Colbert tried to trap him on live TV. The questions got personal. The mood turned tense. So Chuck stood up, took off his mic, and walked out. Welcome to Chuck Norris Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. The harsh glare of the studio lights seemed to accentuate the lines of experience on his face. A face known to millions. A face that had stared down villains on screen and championed quiet strength off it. Tonight, however, the adversary wasn't a fictional character, nor a philosophical opponent in a staid debate. It was the very air of the room, the expectant hush of the audience, and the man sitting opposite him. A man whose smile, usually a beacon of satirical wit, now seemed to hold a predatory gleam. The Ed Sullivan Theater, a cathedral of late-night television, was thrumming with its usual pre-show energy. Backstage, the hum of hurried conversations, the clatter of equipment, and the faint scent of stage makeup mingled, creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos that always preceded the magic of broadcast. He had arrived with little fanfare, his presence a quiet counterpoint to the surrounding bustle. He was here ostensibly to discuss a new philanthropic endeavor, a foundation dedicated to empowering underprivileged youth through discipline and outdoor education, a cause close to his heart, one that reflected his own lifelong commitment to integrity and self-reliance. He moved through the narrow corridors with an unhurried gait, his weathered denim jacket and simple boots a stark contrast to the tailored suits and frantic energy of the production staff. He nodded politely to those who greeted him, his eyes clear and steady, taking in the scene with the calm observation of a man who had seen many such stages yet remained unimpressed by their artifice. The host, a titan of late night, a jester who had cleverly positioned himself as a kingmaker and a moral arbiter, was in his element. He was seen briefly, laughing boisterously with his writers, his gestures expansive, his energy filling the room, even from a distance. There was a particular sharpness to his demeanor tonight, an almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, as if he were preparing for a sparring match rather than an interview. The initial moments on stage were deceptively benign. The roar of the audience, the familiar theme music, the host's effusive welcome, all standard fare. He settled into the plush guest chair, the lights warm on his face, and responded to the initial questions with his characteristic blend of thoughtful sincerity and understated humor. They spoke of the new foundation, its aims, its inspirations. He shared a brief, humorous anecdote about a recent fishing trip, his delivery dry and perfectly timed, drawing easy laughter from the crowd. The host, too, played his part, nodding, chuckling, his questions seemingly designed to highlight the guest's altruism and down-to-earth appeal. For a fleeting 10 minutes, it was everything a late-night interview promised to be: charming, engaging, and comfortably predictable. The guest, a man whose public persona was built on quiet strength and unshakable principle, seemed at ease, the years of media scrutiny having forged in him a calm resilience. He spoke not of past glories or cinematic triumphs, but of the future, of the potential in young lives, of the importance of guidance and unwavering values. His words were measured, each sentence carrying a weight of conviction that resonated even in the cavernous studio. The host listened, or appeared to, his head tilted, a practiced expression of interest on his face. But as the first commercial break approached, a subtle shift occurred. The host's smile tightened, his eyes, which had been crinkling at the corners with mirth, now held a more focused, calculating look. The transition was almost imperceptible, like the first faint tremor before an earthquake, a warning that the seemingly solid ground was about to give way. The earlier warmth in the studio began to cool, replaced by a new, unspoken tension. The rhythm of the conversation, once easy and flowing, now hesitated, faltered, as if sensing the precipice ahead. The guest, ever observant, registered the change, his own posture becoming a fraction more alert, his gaze steadying on the man opposite him, a silent acknowledgement that the pleasantries were over and the real interview, the one lurking beneath the surface, was about to begin. He had faced down tougher crowds and more overt antagonists, But there was something uniquely insidious about this particular brand of media engagement, the kind that cloaked its aggression in the guise of sophisticated banter and intellectual superiority. The easy rhythm of the initial segment fractured as the host, with a carefully calibrated shift in tone, began to steer the conversation away from philanthropy and towards more contentious ground. His questions, once broad and inviting, now became pointed, barbed with insinuations that were as subtle as they were unsettling. "It's admirable, this work you're doing," the host began, his smile a little too wide, his eyes a little too bright. "But some might say it's a convenient way to polish a public image, especially for someone whose on-screen persona has often been, shall we say, less than gentle. All that stoic heroism, the lone wolf narrative, it's a powerful brand, isn't it?" The guest met the veiled accusation with a calm, unwavering gaze. "My work with young people isn't about a brand, Stephen. It's about responsibility. What I portrayed on screen is entertainment. What I do in my life is based on principles I learned long before I ever stepped in front of camera." His voice, a low rumble, carried no defensiveness, only a quiet assertion of truth. But the host was not to be deterred. He leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from amiable inquisitor to something more akin to a prosecutor. "Principles are interesting things, aren't they? They can be quite flexible. For instance, you've spoken in the past about the importance of traditional values, about discipline. Yet, Hollywood, your industry, is often seen as the epicenter of moral relativism, a place where traditional values are frankly mocked. How do you reconcile that apparent contradiction?" The air in the studio grew palpably cooler. The audience, sensing the shift, became noticeably quieter, their earlier laughter replaced by an expectant stillness. The guest took a slow breath, his hands resting loosely on the arms of his chair. "I don't see a contradiction in holding personal values while working in a diverse industry. My beliefs guide my actions, not my judgment of others. And I believe that true strength lies not in imposing your views, but in living them with integrity, regardless of your environment." The host pounced on the word integrity. Integrity. That's a strong word. But let's talk about specific instances. There have been reports, whispers in the industry about your association with certain figures, individuals whose own integrity has been, shall we say, publicly questioned. Individuals who espouse views that seem diametrically opposed to the very tolerance and inclusivity Hollywood champions. He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "Doesn't your continued association with such people, however private, cast a shadow on your own proclaimed values?" The guest's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was no longer a discussion. It was an interrogation, carefully designed to corner him, to force him into a defensive posture. "Stephen," he said, his voice still measured but with an underlying firmness, "you're dealing in hearsay and innuendo. If you have a specific, factual concern, I'll address it. But I won't engage in character assassination based on whispers." The host gave a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "Oh, I think it's more than whispers. There are documented connections, business dealings, appearances at events. It paints a picture that some of your admirers might find disappointing. Are you saying these associations are fabricated?" The guest's eyes, which had remained calm, now held a glint of steel. "I'm saying that you're taking things out of context and attempting to create a narrative that suits your agenda. I have a wide range of acquaintances from all walks of life. I don't conduct background checks on everyone I shake hands with, nor do I believe in guilt by association. My principles are demonstrated by my actions, not by a curated list of approved acquaintances." The studio crew exchanged uneasy glances. The floor manager, usually a whirlwind of activity, stood frozen near the main camera, his headset askew. This was not the interview they had prepped for. The guest's quiet dignity was beginning to make the host's aggressive questioning seem almost boorish. The host, however, seemed oblivious, or perhaps emboldened, by the changing atmosphere. He pressed on, his voice taking on a tone of mock concern. "But surely, as a public figure, as a role model to many, you have a responsibility to be more discerning. to distance yourself from those whose actions or beliefs might tarnish your own reputation, or worse, lend credibility to harmful ideologies. The trap was clearly laid. The host's smile had become a fixed, almost predatory rictus. He held up a sheaf of papers, not to read from them, but as a prop, a symbol of supposed research and damning evidence. "Let's not be coy," he said, his voice dripping with insinuation. "We're talking about your long-standing friendship with a certain political commentator, a man known for his rather strident views on immigration, on social justice, views that many, including a large portion of this audience, would find deeply offensive. How does someone who champions youth and opportunity maintain such a close tie with someone who actively works to deny opportunity to others?" The guest remained silent for a long moment, his gaze locked on the host. The quiet in the studio was absolute, a vacuum into which the host's accusations had been thrown. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, each word chosen with care. "First," he began, "you're making assumptions about the nature of a friendship and about the influence one person has over another's deeply held beliefs. I have friends with whom I disagree on many things. I believe in dialogue, not echo chambers. Second, you're attempting to hold me accountable for the views of another person, which is a tactic as old as it is disingenuous." The host feigned surprise. "Disingenuous? I'm simply asking how you reconcile your public image as a man of compassion with your private associations. Are you saying your friendship with this individual doesn't imply some level of endorsement of his views?" The guest's expression remained unreadable, but a flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps, or weariness, crossed his features. "Endorsement is a strong word, Stephen. Friendship is about connection, history, shared experiences. It's not a blanket approval of every thought or statement. If we all disowned everyone with whom we had a political or philosophical disagreement, this world would be a very lonely and, frankly, a very dangerous place. My own principles teach me to engage, to understand, even when I don't agree, not to condemn from a distance based on a caricature." The host leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. "So, you're a man of dialogue. That's admirable. But what if that dialogue lends your credibility, your considerable influence, to someone who uses their platform to spread division and hate? Isn't there a point where association becomes complicity?" The word complicity hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. The guest's hands, which had been resting calmly, now clenched slightly. He had seen this tactic before, the attempt to paint nuance as weakness, to frame engagement as endorsement. "Complicity implies shared intent or action," he stated, his voice gaining a new edge of authority. "I'm responsible for my own words, my own actions, and the work that I do. I'm not responsible for how others choose to interpret my friendships, nor am I responsible for policing the thoughts of every person I know. My focus is on building bridges, not burning them." Your line of questioning, however, seems intent on the latter. The host seized on this. Building bridges? Or providing cover? There are those who would say that by not publicly denouncing your friends' more extreme statements, you are, in effect, enabling them. That your silence is a form of consent. The guest shook his head slowly. "Silence is not consent, Stephen. Sometimes, silence is a recognition that public denouncements rarely change hearts or minds. Sometimes it's a commitment to private conversation, to a more difficult but potentially more fruitful path. And sometimes," he added, his eyes narrowing, "it's a refusal to be drawn into a media circus designed to generate outrage rather than understanding." The direct challenge to the host's motives was unmistakable. The studio audience, which had been following the exchange with rapt attention, let out a collective murmur. Some faces showed discomfort, others a dawning realization that they were witnessing more than just a contentious interview. They were witnessing a clash of worldviews, a battle over the very nature of public discourse. The host, for the first time, seemed momentarily thrown, his practiced composure faltering. He shuffled his papers, his smile wavering. But the instinct for the offensive, honed by years of televised sparring, quickly reasserted itself. He leaned forward again, his voice regaining its aggressive edge. A media circus? Or accountability? When does private dialogue become an excuse for public inaction, especially when real harm is being done by the rhetoric you seem so reluctant to condemn? The host, recovering quickly, pressed his perceived advantage. So, you're saying your friendship, your dialogue, is more important than standing against what many consider to be genuinely harmful rhetoric? Rhetoric that affects real people, real communities? He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing all the world's injustices. It seems like a convenient shield, this dialogue defense, to avoid taking a difficult, perhaps unpopular stand. The guest's patience, a deep well forged over decades of public life, was visibly thinning. It's not a shield, Stephen. It's a principle. The principle that human connection, even amidst disagreement, is vital. The principle that demonizing those with different views, however offensive you might find them, achieves nothing but further division. My stand is evident in the work I do, in the life I lead, in the values I try to impart to the young people my foundation supports. It's not found in performative denunciations designed to satisfy a particular political audience. The phrase performative denunciation struck a nerve. The host's face flushed slightly. Performative? Are you suggesting that taking a moral stance against hate speech is merely a performance? That's a rather cynical view, isn't it? Especially from someone who has built a career on performing. I'm suggesting, the guest countered, his voice firm but devoid of anger, that there's a difference between genuine conviction and public posturing. And I'm suggesting that your current line of questioning feels more like an attempt to trap me into the latter than to understand the former. You seem less interested in my actual views and more interested in creating a moment, a soundbite, that will play well for your base. The accusation hung heavy in the studio. The camera zoomed in slightly on the host's face, capturing the subtle tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. He was being outmaneuvered, not by aggression, but by a calm, principled refusal to play his game. He tried a different tack, adopting a tone of mock sympathy. Look, I understand it's uncomfortable. No one likes to be challenged on their associations, especially when they're problematic. But as a public figure, someone people look up to, don't you feel a greater responsibility to ensure your private life aligns with the positive image you project? The guest let out a small, weary sigh. My private life is just that, Stephen, private. And my public image is a byproduct of my work, not a carefully constructed artifice. The responsibility, I feel, is to be true to my own conscience, to treat others with respect, and to contribute positively where I can. It is not my responsibility to live up to some idealized, politically pure version of myself that exists only in your or your writer's imaginations. The host's smile vanished completely. So, you're above scrutiny? Is that it? Your conscience is the only guide, and to hell with public perception or the impact of your associations. The guest leaned forward, his gaze intense. No one is above scrutiny, Stephen. But scrutiny should be fair, it should be based on facts, and it should be aimed at understanding, not at character assassination. What you're engaging in here feels dangerously close to the latter. You're not seeking truth, you're seeking a scalp. The raw honesty of the statement silenced the studio once more. Even the crew members seemed to hold their breath. The guest had not raised his voice, had not resorted to insults, but his words had meticulously dismantled the host's pretense of journalistic inquiry. He had exposed the interview for what it was, an ambush. The host, for a moment, looked genuinely taken aback, as if the guest had violated some unspoken rule of the celebrity interview game. He opened his mouth, then closed it, seemingly at a loss for a retort that wouldn't sound petulant or defensive. The power dynamic had shifted. The guest, through his unwavering adherence to principle and his refusal to be goaded, had taken control. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was a man defending his integrity, and in doing so, he was exposing the hollowness of the attack. The host, visibly flustered but unwilling to cede control, attempted to regain the offensive by shifting the focus directly to his guest's iconic on-screen persona. "You know," he began, a sarcastic edge creeping into his voice. "For a man who has played so many heroes, characters who always knew right from wrong, who always took a stand, you seem remarkably hesitant to do so in real life. What would those characters think of your reluctance to condemn views that are clearly causing harm?" The guest met this new line of attack with a quiet, almost pitying look. "Stephen, you seem to be confusing fictional narratives with the complexities of human existence. The characters I've played operate in worlds where good and evil are often clearly defined, where a decisive punch or a principled speech can resolve conflict. Real life, as I'm sure you're aware, is rarely so simple. In the real world, taking a stand often involves more than a public declaration. It involves difficult conversations, nuanced understanding, and a commitment to principles even when they are unpopular or inconvenient." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And frankly, my characters were often men of action, not men who used their platforms to publicly shame and humiliate others under the guise of moral righteousness." The implication was clear, and it landed with pinpoint accuracy. The host's face tightened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "So, you're saying there's no place for public condemnation of harmful ideologies? That we should all just have quiet, private conversations while hate speech proliferates?" "I'm saying," the guest corrected, his tone measured but firm, "that there are different ways to combat harm. Public condemnation has its place, but it is not the only tool, nor is it always the most effective. Sometimes, it merely serves to entrench divisions and to provide a platform for those who thrive on outrage. My approach has always been to build, to create, to foster understanding where I can. That may not be as headline-grabbing as your preferred method, but I believe it has a more lasting impact." The host leaned back, a dismissive wave of his hand. "Building, creating, fostering understanding. Those are all very noble sentiments. But they can also be a convenient excuse for inaction, for avoiding the discomfort of confronting views that are fundamentally opposed to a just and equitable society. It's easy to talk about dialogue when you're not the one being targeted by the hate." The guest's eyes narrowed. "And you believe that by inviting me here tonight and attempting to corner me into denouncing a friend, you are somehow striking a blow for a just and equitable society, Stephen? Or are you simply using a complex issue to generate controversy and boost your ratings, regardless of the collateral damage to reputations or relationships?" The directness of the question seemed to stun the host momentarily. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a flicker of something unreadable. Anger? Embarrassment? In his eyes. The audience, which had been largely silent, began to murmur, the sound a low hum of discomfort and dawning realization. They were witnessing a masterclass in how to dismantle a public ambush with grace and unwavering principle. The guest had refused to be baited, refused to be drawn into a shouting match, and in doing so, he had exposed the host's tactics for what they were, a calculated attempt at public shaming. The host, sensing he was losing not just the argument but the room, tried one last desperate gambit. He adopted a tone of feigned sincerity, his eyes wide with mock concern. "Look, all I'm trying to understand, and I think our viewers are too, is how someone with your stature, someone who professes such strong moral convictions, can appear to be so indifferent to the very real harm caused by the ideologies of people you associate with. It's a legitimate question, isn't it?" The guest met his gaze, his own expression one of profound disappointment. "It would be a legitimate question, Stephen, if it were asked with genuine curiosity and a desire for understanding. But it wasn't, was it? It was asked as an accusation, as a trap. And that, I think, says more about your intentions tonight than any answer I could possibly give." The weight of that last statement settled over the studio, a palpable silence broken only by the almost inaudible hum of the broadcast equipment. The guest, having calmly and methodically dismantled the host's aggressive line of questioning, now shifted his posture subtly. It was not a movement of aggression, but of finality, the quiet squaring of shoulders by a man who had reached his limit of tolerance for disrespect. "You know, Stephen," he began, his voice still low but carrying a new resonance, a timbre that commanded absolute attention. "I came here tonight in good faith. I came to talk about work that I'm passionate about, work that aims to bring a little light into what can often be a very dark world. I agreed to this interview with the understanding that we would have a respectful conversation as professionals, as two people who, despite any differences, could engage with a degree of civility." He paused, his gaze sweeping briefly over the silent audience, then returning to the host, who sat motionless, his earlier smirk entirely gone, replaced by a look of dawning, uncomfortable realization. Instead, the guest continued, "You've chosen to use this platform not for dialogue, but for a thinly veiled inquisition. You've made assumptions, leveled accusations, and attempted to paint me into a corner based on incomplete information and, frankly, a rather biased interpretation of my associations and beliefs. You haven't sought understanding. You've sought confrontation." The host started to speak, a reflexive "now, wait a minute," forming on his lips, but the guest raised a hand, a simple, almost gentle gesture that nevertheless had the effect of silencing him instantly. "No, Esteban, let me finish. For the past 20 minutes, you've interrogated me, not interviewed me. You've put my character on trial, questioned my integrity, and attempted to dictate what my moral responsibilities should be, all according to your specific ideological framework. And you've done so with a distinct lack of the very respect and tolerance you so readily preach to others." The air in the studio was thick with unspoken recriminations. The camera operators, seasoned professionals, kept their lenses focused, but even they seemed to be holding their breath, aware that they were capturing a moment that would undoubtedly become a landmark in late-night television history, though not for the reasons the host might have intended. "I believe in accountability," the guest went on, his voice imbued with a quiet power that was far more impactful than any shout could have been. "I believe in it for myself, and I believe in it for others. But accountability requires fairness. It requires a genuine examination of facts, not a predetermined narrative. What you've done here tonight is not accountability, Stephen. It's an ambush. And frankly, it's beneath the dignity of this show, and I would have hoped beneath yours." The host's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. There was anger, certainly, at being so thoroughly and publicly outmaneuvered on his own stage. There was embarrassment, a dawning awareness of how this confrontation would be perceived by the wider world. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a flicker of shame, a momentary recognition of the truth in the guest's words. "I have spent a lifetime," the guest said, his gaze unwavering, "trying to conduct myself with a measure of grace, trying to treat people with the respect I hope to receive in return. I have made mistakes, like any man, but I have always strived to learn from them, to be better. I don't claim to have all the answers, and I certainly don't claim to be a paragon of virtue. But I do know the difference between a genuine inquiry and a public shaming. And this," he gestured around the studio, "has been the latter." He then did something that no one, least of all the host, expected. He began to calmly, methodically, unclip his microphone. The small, metallic click as he detached it from his lapel seemed to echo in the cavernous silence. The act of unclipping the microphone was a statement in itself, more eloquent than any further words of condemnation. It was a severance, a deliberate uncoupling from the artifice of the show, a quiet rejection of the host's authority and the terms of engagement he had so aggressively tried to impose. The host watched, momentarily paralyzed, as his guest placed the small device neatly on the edge of the coffee table that separated them. The gesture was devoid of theatricality, yet it carried an immense weight. "What are you doing?" the host finally managed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and a dawning panic. He had orchestrated confrontations before, had pushed guests to the brink, but rarely, if ever, had he faced such a calm, dignified, and utterly definitive shutdown. "I believe," the guest said, his voice maintaining its even, measured tone, "that this conversation, if one can even call it that, has run its course. I came here with the intention of discussing my work, of sharing something positive with your audience. It's clear now that you had a different agenda. He rose slowly from his chair, not with the abruptness of anger, but with the deliberate grace of a man who had made a decision and was now acting upon it with complete conviction. His full height seemed to command the stage, diminishing the host, who remained seated, looking up at him with an expression that was rapidly shifting from aggression to something akin to desperation. "You can't just," the host began, half rising from his own chair, his hand outstretched as if to physically prevent his guest from leaving. "You can't just walk out. We're live. We have commercial coming up. This isn't how it works." The guest looked at him, not with contempt, but with a profound, almost sorrowful disappointment. "Actually, Stephen," he said, his voice still quiet but cutting through the host's bluster, "this is exactly how it works when one party in a supposed dialogue refuses to engage with integrity. When respect is abandoned, when the intent is to humiliate rather than to understand, then the conversation is over. There is nothing left to discuss." Several audience members gasped. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. They had come expecting laughter, celebrity anecdotes, perhaps a bit of light political satire. They were getting a live, unscripted masterclass in principled defiance. The floor manager was now frantically signaling from off-camera, his face a mask of alarm, but the host seemed incapable of responding, his gaze fixed on his departing guest. "But the viewers, my audience, they expect," the host stammered, his usual articulate glibness deserting him entirely. "They expect a show. This is going to be a disaster." The guest paused at the edge of the stage, near the curtained exit. He turned back, not to re-engage, but to deliver a final, parting observation. "Your audience, Stephen, deserves better than what you offer them tonight. They deserve hosts who enlighten, who entertain with wit and intelligence, not hosts who resort to character assassination for cheap thrills or political points. They deserve respect, just as your guests do." His eyes swept over the audience, a brief, encompassing glance that seemed to acknowledge their presence, their witness to this extraordinary breach of television decorum. "And as for this being a disaster," he continued, his gaze returning to the stricken host, "perhaps it will be, but if it is, it will be a disaster of your own making, a consequence of your own choices. You had an opportunity tonight to have a meaningful exchange, to explore different perspectives. You chose, instead, to try and score points, to create a moment at my expense. Well, you've certainly created a moment, Stephen. I hope it's everything you wish for." The host looked as if he had been physically struck. His face, usually so animated, was pale and slack-jawed. He sank back in his chair, the fight completely drained out of him. He had played a high-stakes game and had catastrophically miscalculated, underestimating not just his guest's resilience, but also his unwavering commitment to his own dignity. The control room was in uproar. Producers were shouting into headsets, unsure whether to cut to an emergency commercial, to let the cameras continue rolling on the host's stunned silence, or to somehow try and salvage the wreckage of the interview. With a final, almost imperceptible nod that seemed to encompass the entire surreal scene, the stunned host, the silent audience, the frantic crew, he turned and walked decisively through the curtained exit. The sound of his footsteps on the hollow stage floor seemed to echo with a profound finality. For a few long seconds, the studio was utterly still, a tableau of suspended animation. The host remained frozen at his desk, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. The audience, unsure of the protocol for such an unprecedented event, sat in a mixture of shock and nervous anticipation. Then, a single person in the back rows began to clap. It was a hesitant, solitary sound at first, but it was quickly joined by another, and then another, until a wave of spontaneous applause swept through the theater. It wasn't the polite, cued applause of a typical studio audience. It was a raw, emotional ovation, a recognition of the quiet courage and unwavering integrity they had just witnessed. It was applause for the man who had refused to be bullied, who had stood his ground with dignity. The host, jolted by the sound, looked out at his audience, his expression shifting from shock to a kind of bewildered betrayal. The applause wasn't for him. It was for the guest he had driven away. The realization seemed to visibly deflate him. His shoulders slumped, and he stared down at his scattered notes as if they held the answers to how his meticulously planned segment had imploded so spectacularly. Backstage, chaos reigned. The guest's publicist, who had been watching the interview unfold with growing alarm from the wings, was already on the phone, her voice a low, urgent murmur as she began the inevitable process of damage control. Or, perhaps more accurately, narrative framing. The show's producers were huddled in a tight, anxious circle, their faces grim. This was more than just a bad segment. This was a potential ratings disaster, a public relations nightmare that could have lasting repercussions for the show and its host. The floor manager finally regained enough composure to signal for an emergency commercial break. The studio lights dimmed abruptly, plunging the stage into a momentary gloom that seemed to mirror the host's own rapidly darkening prospects. As the commercial jingle began to play, jarringly upbeat in the wake of the preceding drama, the host slowly rose from his desk. He didn't speak, didn't look at his crew, just walked off stage with the stiff, uncertain gait of a man who knows he has made a terrible, irrevocable mistake. In the green room, the guest was met by a small team. There were no recriminations, no I told you so's. Just a quiet understanding and a shared sense of relief that the ordeal was over. He accepted a bottle of water, his hand steady, his demeanor betraying none of the inner turmoil that such a confrontation must have provoked. He had done what he felt he had to do, said what needed to be said. The consequences, whatever they might be, would be faced with the same quiet resolve he had displayed on stage. Already, his phone was beginning to buzz with messages, the digital tremors of the earthquake he had just triggered in the media landscape. The story was breaking, faster than any official statement could be drafted. Clips of the confrontation, likely filmed on illicit cell phones from the audience, would soon be flooding the internet. The narrative was no longer his or the host's to control. It belonged to the court of public opinion. But as he prepared to leave the studio, a place he had entered hours earlier with professional courtesy and a willingness to engage, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had spoken his truth. And in a world increasingly dominated by manufactured outrage and performative righteousness, sometimes that was the most powerful stand a man could take. The fallout was immediate and seismic. Before the show had even returned from its unscheduled commercial break, snippets of the confrontation, likely captured on audience cell phones despite studio prohibitions, began to surface online. Hashtags like hashtag Colbert Meltdown and hashtag Norris Stands Firm exploded across social media platforms, with initial reactions overwhelmingly in support of the guest who had refused to be a pawn in the host's game. By the time the heavily truncated episode finished airing on the East Coast, the internet was a raging inferno of commentary, debate, and outrage. Major news outlets, sensing a significant media event, scrambled to piece together the story. Their websites quickly populated with headlines that screamed of on-air explosions and celebrity walkouts. The guest's departure from the studio was quiet and dignified. He offered a polite nod to the shell-shocked production assistants who scurried past him in the backstage labyrinth, his expression unreadable but resolute. He had not sought this confrontation, had not intended for the evening to devolve into such a public spectacle. Yet, faced with what he perceived as a deliberate and disrespectful ambush, he had responded in the only way his principles would allow, by standing firm and then, when dialogue proved impossible, by removing himself from the toxic arena. The host, meanwhile, was reportedly in a state of near collapse backstage. Eyewitness accounts, later leaked to entertainment blogs, painted a picture of a man unaccustomed to having his authority so thoroughly challenged, his carefully constructed persona so publicly dismantled. Accusations flew, blame was cast, and the usually jovial atmosphere of the post-show wind-down was replaced by a funereal gloom. The network executives were, to put it mildly, apoplectic. Emergency meetings were convened, running late into the night. The primary concern was not the guest's well-being or the ethical implications of the host's conduct, but the potential damage to the network's brand and the show's lucrative advertising revenue. In the days that followed, the incident dominated the news cycle. Pundits from across the political spectrum weighed in, dissecting every nuance of the exchange. Some praised the host for asking tough questions, though this contingent was noticeably in the minority and often came from outlets with a clear ideological alignment with his perceived targets. Most commentators, however, sided with the guest, lauding his composure, his principled stand, and his articulate defense of his integrity. They saw in his actions a powerful rebuke to a media culture that often seemed to prioritize sensationalism over substance, confrontation over conversation. Op-eds appeared in major newspapers. Some analyzed the decline of civility in public discourse, using the interview as a prime example. Others focused on the responsibilities of media figures, questioning whether the pursuit of ratings and viral moments had eclipsed the journalistic imperative for fairness and accuracy. The guest himself remained largely silent in the immediate aftermath, issuing only a brief, dignified statement through his publicist. "I regret that the interview did not proceed as originally intended. I have always believed in respectful dialogue, even amidst disagreement. When that respect is absent, I believe it is incumbent upon any individual to uphold their own dignity." The host, under immense pressure from the network and facing a torrent of public criticism, eventually issued a carefully worded apology. It was a masterpiece of corporate speak, expressing regret that the interview had become contentious and acknowledging that some of the questions may have been perceived as unfair. It notably stopped short of a direct apology for his own conduct or for the specific accusations he had leveled. This non-apology did little to quell the firestorm.